If you're dipping your toe into self-publishing, you might be wondering, what are the difficult things that you might face? Well, let me tell you about my job. Hello, Space Cats! I started publishing my children's books in 2012 with Vincent and the Vampires. And for the next 2 years, I brought out 2 books a year. I'm currently working on number 15 and I've got 16 maturing in my brain like a stinky old cheese. Not all of those books were self-published. 3 of them were through a traditional publishing house. So I've got a foot in both camps. I've got my technique for writing and illustrating children's books quite slick now. But I do admit there are things that are difficult or so dull they make my ears drop off. Luckily, I always carry spare ears just in case this happens. Here are 5 things that I find difficult about my job. Number 1, thumbnails. Putting the idea out of my head and down onto paper can be quite tricky. Doing my thumbnails is the hardest part of the creative experience for me. And thumbnails are those little teeny tiny postage-sized drawings that you do before you really start doing any other visual representation of your story. It's all about getting the right pace, filling the right information on the right number of pages, and making sure that those pages are the best reflection of your story that they possibly can be. It feels like it takes up a lot of brain space and leaves me quite exhausted and utterly unable to make decisions like what is for dinner. I quite often have to make several drafts of thumbnails, and I've even taken to making little cutout versions that I stick down to an A3 board just so I can move things around easily. The book that I'm currently working on was even more tricky because it has 96 pages rather than your usual 32. It took me quite a few weeks of trying to get my head around which part of the story should be on the page, to give the reader the best experience and to get my story across. My best advice to do this is to make your thumbnails something that is really easy to edit, whether that's making them digitally or just on little tiny pieces of paper and in pencil so that you can easily move them around. I find once I've done this stage, it makes the rest of the creative experience much easier, and it's absolutely crucial to get that done first. Number 2, distraction. Working at home on my own, I'm accountable only to myself. The thing is, I'm not really on my own. There's my family, and the dogs, and the birdies singing outside, the washing that needs hanging out, the postman, the fluff that I keep seeing everywhere, space that needs staring into, cakes that need eating, and tea that needs drinking. It's a full-time job. For the last 4 years, I've been using a bullet journal, and I found it makes my day run much more smoothly. I have a bullet list of things that need to be done, ideally, on that day. As I complete them, I put a line through the bullet. And if they don't get done, I add them to next day's bullets. If they are urgent and need to be done on that day, I add an asterisk or I highlight them. I give myself a maximum of 3 urgent things that need to be done on that day. Anything else that happens is an absolute bonus. It's really easy to get caught up in making toast and then realising you've run out of jam, and before you know it you're in a hedgerow picking berries, and then you go home and you make conserve, all instead of doing your taxes. Which leads me on to number 3, admin. Gah! Admin! And this includes emails, phone calls, text messages, online meetings, accounts, and reporting those accounts back to the government. As a self-employed person, it's just one of those things you have to do. If you were employed by someone else, the only thing on that list that you wouldn't have to do is the financial stuff. But then your employer might ask you to do things that you wouldn't necessarily make yourself do. I freely admit that I am not the swiftest of persons to respond to messages, and for that I deeply apologise. But to make up for it, I am quite good at making gluten-free pizza bases, and I'm really good at folding washing. Not very helpful in my job, but hey, you've got to take the small wins in life. I actually really do like looking through my YouTube comments, and I try to do that on a daily basis. Most people are absolutely lovely, and I only ever get the odd person. So thank you everyone, and even you, Mr. Odd, you do you. Number 3, not being too precious. You might have heard me say before that one of the best bits of advice that I got from uni, my tutor said, don't be too precious about your work. Just this very week, I've been working on a project, a long-term project that I've been doing since about last August. I'm glad to say I am now in the final stages and it's shortly going to print. I'm working with a really lovely team and the project has been an absolute joy to do. But the edits and the finished, as I thought, piece of work went off to our funders. And when it came back, there were another 2 pages of edits to do. One of the things they asked was for the typeface to be changed. This meant a lot of extra work, going through each of those layers with text on and changing them all to a different typeface and font. I looked at the typeface that they suggested and compared it to the one that I'd used and thought, I can't really see much of a difference. I think they're being a bit picky. The email from them was received fairly late on Friday afternoon. So after having that initial comparison, I decided to leave it for the weekend and come back to it on Monday. Monday morning rocked around and fresh as a daisy, I went and had another look at their suggestions. And by gumbo, they were absolutely right. The new typeface looks so much better and was so much more in keeping with the rest of the project. Their revisions took me another 4 hours, but it was definitely worth it. Sometimes when you're working on a project and you have put so much energy and effort and time into it, you are absolutely loath to change it, or worse still, bin it completely and start again. I think it's best to take some time and let that initial emotion subside and then go back and have another look at it to see if it's the right thing to do. Don't be too precious. This advice, plus my belief in you getting everything you need and not necessarily everything you want, came in very handy one day. I was doing some deep cleaning on my old PC because I was running out of space, so I was moving a lot of files from one drive to another drive. When I came back to it the following day, all of my book files had gone. Every single piece of work that I had been working on for at least 10 years with my books had gone. They were not in the old drive and they were not where I thought I'd put them in the new drive. Let me put this into context. If I ever wanted to reprint any of my books, well, I couldn't. They were gone. At that moment, I felt all the blood drain out of my face, and I could have thrown myself to the floor and berated God and lost the will to live. It was a sliding doors moment. But instead, I decided to trust the universe. I decided not to freak out. For a couple of days, I really thought I had lost everything. And then I found them. All of my files, all of my books, in a folder marked books, but in a place where I didn't really expect to find them. Those few days could have been awful. Instead, I chose not to be too precious about it. I told myself they would probably turn up. Maybe they wouldn't. Either way, I felt loads better not worrying about it. And thank you to my tutor for giving me that bit of advice. Number 4, winter and summer. Yes, I know being British means I have to care about the weather, but it really does make a difference to how I feel about the day. I find daylight is super important for my work. If it's a grey day and it barely even properly gets light, then my work suffers. And not just because it affects my mood, but because it means I can't see colours properly. And this goes on for months. Literally from the middle of November through to at least the end of February, it's pretty relentless. I don't really have a magic solution for this. I just tend to hibernate and get done what I can. From April, I have the most productive time. Light levels are up, days are much longer, and the temperature's good. But things slow down again when we have the hot days of summer. It can be pretty unbearable to work in my studio when it's 38 degrees in here. I have a tin roof. It's like an oven. So I decamp back into my house where it's a lot cooler. Although the daylight hours are much longer, I feel I can't overwork during these hot days. So I finish about 2 o'clock or sometimes a bit earlier. I gather all my stuff together and I go and chuck myself in the sea to bob around for a little bit and get nice and cool again. And that's it really, the worst or hardest bits of my work. I should also mention marketing, but I daren't. It's such a massive subject and something that really needs a whole series devoted to. And to be honest, I might lose the will to live if I did that. What about you? What do you find is hard about your work? Are you self-publishing already? What do you find difficult? Next week, I'll be looking at how to make a great protagonist character. Until then, I'm off to buff a buffoon until they shine. I will see you next week. Nano, nano.